Thank you for coming. My name is Aaron Rosenblum, and I am delighted to welcome you this evening to the Sustainability Series. I am the Health and Science Librarian at Portland Public Library. I will be your library host, and if you have any questions or any needs or something isn't working, feel free to contact me through the chat. You can see that my display name is Portland Public Library. And tonight's event is the last of our sustainability series for the season. We run fall through spring, and the series is a partnership with the Southern Maine Conservation Collaborative. And this will be the last of the fifth season of the series. So we hope that you will, after tonight's program, have a great summer break, and then rejoin us in the fall. We will plan to get started again in our normal time slot of the fourth Wednesday of the month, and that'll be starting up in September. So keep an eye on the SMCC website and newsletter. Keep an eye on the PPL website and newsletter for more details about our next season. So before we go any further, we would like to offer a land acknowledgement. And acknowledgement is a simple way of showing respect and a step toward correcting the stories and practices that erase the Indigenous people's history and culture, and toward inviting and honoring truth. So Portland Public Library would like to acknowledge that the land on which we gather tonight is the occupied and unceded territory of the Wabanaki, the people of the place where the sun first looks our way, who have stewarded this land throughout the generations. We extend our respect and gratitude to the many Indigenous people and their ancestors whose rich histories and vibrant communities include the Abenaki, the Mullaseet, the Micmac, the Passamaquoddy, and Penobscot nations, and all the Native communities who have lived in Chuabunkeg for over 3,000 generations in what is now called New England and the Canadian Maritimes. We thank them for their strength and resilience in protecting this land and aspire to uphold our responsibilities according to their example. So now I would like to hand it over to Jess Burton, the Executive Director of the Southern Maine Conservation Collaborative, to introduce tonight's speaker.
Thank you, Aaron. I am Jess Burton, with the Director of the Southern Maine Conservation Collaborative. We're a network of land and water conservation organizations that focus on increasing our impact here in Southern Maine and beyond. And partnering with Portland Public Library is one of our greatest joys, because it helps us really get to the core of one of our focus points, which is to broaden the conversation of conservation. And so through the library, we are able to really lean into that goal. And this night, we are excited to co-host one of our member organizations, the Wild Seed Project, and the great Heather McCargo, who is the founder of Wild Seed Project. Heather is an educator with 35 years of experience in plant propagation, landscape design, and conservation. She was the head plant propagator at the Native Plant Trust's Garden in the Woods during the 1990s, worked at landscape architecture and planning firms, specializing in ecological design, and has been a contributor to several research projects with USAID, the National Gardening Association, and MOFGA. She has lectured nationally and is widely published in journals and magazines such as Horticulture, American Nurseryman, MOFGA, and Wild Ones. Heather designed the master plan for the medicinal gardens at Avena Botanicals in Rockland. She has a BA in plant ecology from Hampshire College and an MA from the Conway School of Landscape Design. We are really super excited to welcome Heather. Thank you so much, Heather, for being with us tonight. And I will turn the proverbial mic, over to you.
Thank you. Well, I'm thrilled to be here. Hopefully winding up the all on computer speaking, but I'm still happy to be here because I do recognize that it makes it easier for a lot of people to get out and hear these different talks. But I'm really excited to share with you tonight the fascinating life cycle of native plants, because the life of our native wild plants is very different from domesticated crops and garden plants. And central to Wild Seed Project's mission is to demystify the native seeds and the kind of practices that most, gardeners learn don't translate to the needs of our wild plants. So today what I'm going to do is show you some of the really interesting and different flowering, seed ripening, germination, pollinator, wildlife support needs of some of our wild plants. And then I'm going to explain to you simple outdoor seed sowing techniques that anyone can do without sophisticated facilities. Now, before I start, I want to just remind everyone what a seed is. A seed is an embryonic plant with a root, shoot, some food, which can be starchy or oily, and that's the part that we and other animals like to eat. And then it's all encased in a protective covering called the seed coat. The seeds form in the ovary of the mother plant. And this mature ovary can be thin and dry, or it can be thick and fleshy like in a fruit. So for instance, a blueberry, the actual fruit that we, the delicious blueberry, that's actually the ovary of the mother plant, but the little tiny seeds inside represent the next generation. And so those seeds are the result of sexual reproduction, where two or more individuals with plants get cross-pollinated, and each seed is genetically unique. Just like you and I are genetically unique, and even you from your family, if you have the same parents and several siblings, you can see how unique each individual comes out. And it's this genetic diversity that's what all species, whether they're animals or plants or fungi, they're all species need this genetic diversity to be able to adapt to changing conditions. And our world has always changed, and obviously right now we're undergoing a period of rapid change accelerated by us, but this genetic diversity is really important. Looking at this picture here, you're looking on the left is one of our native lily seeds, the wood lily, those pretty golden flecks. The middle is witch hazel, and the right is milkweed. So I'm going to begin with the spring ephemerals, and these are the slowest and most challenging to germinate and grow. And then I'll move into a wide variety of different native plants. I'll cover about 20 different species that represent the different reproduction of different species. And so if I can forward it, okay, how do I, there, got it. Okay, great. So in this picture, we're looking at trout lily. That's the yellow flower. It's one of our wild woodland lily species. And the little white flower is our wood anemone. And these are both true ephemerals, which means they leaf out and bloom really early in the spring, and then they go dormant and disappear. And that's happening right now. And looking at the trout lily, like a lot of our wood lily species, they have a particularly slow reproduction. So they're pollinated by early spring, mostly bees and some other little insects. And after the flower goes by, you'll get about a ½ inch across oval seed pod that's fleshy and green. And as the plant goes dormant, it all turns tan and then literally disappears at the leaf litter. It's laying flat on the leaf litter when the seeds ripen. When they ripen, the pod opens up, and ants are the disperser of these seeds. So the ants come, carry the seeds off. There's a little fleshy protrusion on the seeds that the ants like to eat. They eat it and then discard the seed in the leaf, under the leaf litter in the ant compost pile, shall we call it. And those seeds that will lay there under the soil, under the leaves and right in the moist soil, and they will germinate not next spring, but the following spring. So 2 years before those seeds actually will germinate. And then they take about a dozen years to reach flowering. So this is one of our wild plants that will never be able to be easily produced by the nursery trade. And in fact, quite a lot of these are dug from the wild and sold in the nursery trade, practice that I do not support. The little wood lily is a little quicker to germinate. Those seeds are green when they're ripe and they fall off the plants. The ants also carry them off, and they will germinate the next spring, and they take about 4 years before they will be blooming again or reproducing. So very slow life cycle on these plants. This is Bloodroot. It's another one of our spring blooming, early spring blooming wildflowers that blooms usually in early April here in Portland. It's pollinated also by small native bees and other little flies and insects. And a patch like this, all the blooming will happen in about a week, and then the petals will fall off, and these beautiful, large, round, deeply scalloped leaves will emerge, and they're usually about 1 foot tall, and a patch can be 1 to a couple feet wide. And about 6 weeks later, so soon, the seed pod will ripen, and it's about 2 inches long, and it's kayak shaped, actually bright green, and then it will split and the seeds will spill out, and within an hour of it splitting, the ants have emerged and carried all the seeds off. So you've got to be quick. They again will eat this little fleshy protrusion and discard the seeds under the leaf litter. And if all goes well and they stay moist, those seeds will germinate the next spring. And it takes about 3 or 4 years for that seed to become mature and reproduce again. And those seeds, like the Trout Lily, those seeds cannot dry out. If they dry out, they won't germinate. Trillium, we've got 4 native species of Trillium in Maine. This is the wake robin or purple Trillium. There's some of this in the woods around Portland, and it usually also blooms around mid-May for about 3 weeks. And then after the flower goes by, this purple pod starts to form, and it's fleshy. And on this species, it's maroon, and other species, it's green. And in usually late July, early August, so really almost 3 months after it's been blooming, that pod will ripen. It will all of a sudden soften and fall off the plant. In the picture on the right, you can see it when it ripened, and that the little brown seeds are about 1/8 of an inch across, and then that creamy colored stuff next to the seeds, that's what the ants are after, and it's called eliosome. And it's it's high in fat and lipids and proteins, and very desirable to the ants. So that's what all these woodland wildflowers that are dispersed by ants, that's what the ants are after. They carry the seed off like the other species, eat the fleshy protrusion, and then discard the seeds under the leaf litter in the moist, warm conditions that are perfect for these seeds to, again, lay under there, and they will germinate after the 2nd spring. So Trillium typically takes about 7 years before it blooms from when the seed ripens. So in that 2nd spring, what will happen is there'll be, when it germinates, there'll be a 1 inch long single leaf that's about 1 inch long and about 1 inch high. And that's all that you'll see that 2nd summer. The 3rd summer, you'll have the classic 3 little Trillium leaves, and then in year 7, typically it will be flowering and reproducing. So these slow growing woodland wildflowers, they are never going to be able to be easily propagated. And I really caution you, a lot of times when you see these for sale, they have been poached from the wild. And that, our native plants are already being stressed by humans taking over the world, and we do not need to be digging them up and planting them in our garden. So I've propagated thousands of these from seed. It's not hard. You just have to know, be able to collect the seeds when they're ripe, sow them right away, and grow them over the time it takes for them to reproduce. We've got other wildflowers that really don't belong in people's gardens. And the pink lady slipper, which are blooming now, are a classic example of that. They're one of our native orchids, and they are bumblebee pollinated. And remember, the pollinator, they don't know they're helping the plant reproduce. They're after nectar and pollen. So with this species, to get at the nectar and pollen, the bee has to climb through a little opening that's at the top of that pink pouch. And they go down into the bottom and their body brushes against the pollen, and then they're hoping to find nectar. Well, in most of our orchids, there is no nectar. So the bumblebee gets down there, fumbles around, doesn't find any nectar, climbs back up and out and goes to another flower. And if you find a patch of lady slipper that has, say, 100 flowers, typically only about 10% of them get pollinated, because bees are smart, and after they've visited a few flowers and haven't found any nectar, they move on to a different species, maybe lowbush blueberry, to pollinate. So luckily, each seed pod on a lady slipper orchid has thousands of teeny dust-like seeds. So even with a low percentage of plants being pollinated, there's still plenty of seed get dispersed. So that seed pod ripens all through the summer and into the fall, and will typically split sometime in late fall or even over the winter and release these tiny dusty seeds. And the lady slipper orchids is a good example of a wildflower that can't be tamed. It's dependent on different mycorrhizal fungi in the soil for its whole life cycle. So all of our native plants have associations with fungi that benefit them in their life cycle. Our trees, our shrubs, our wildflowers, our ferns, they are all dependent on fungi in the soil, but some species cannot exist without it. And the lady slipper orchids are an example of that. And so nobody's figured out how to reproduce these in a nursery. There are a few species that you can propagate from divisions. Pink lady slipper is not one of those. And some of the other species like the yellow lady slipper, the shoddy lady slipper, there are a few laboratories that are cloning them via tissue culture, but that is not helping these plants in the wild. So this is a good example of a wildflower that can't be tamed. Enjoy it in the wild, but don't think you're going to grow it. They cannot be moved. When people move them even supposedly to the perfect site, they typically die out after a couple of years. So just enjoy this and protect it when you see it in the wild. And by the way, those seeds, once they do germinate, they're another one that's a dozen years before it reaches blooming size. So really slow life cycle, but these plants can live for decades. Now I'm going to move into some of the easier plants to grow. This is marsh marigold. Used to be a common wetland plant, not so abundant anymore, especially in Maine, growing in, stream sides, wet meadows, swamps, in woodland swamps, roadside ditches. And so this blooms for about 3 weeks in May with these charming yellow flowers. And after the flower goes by, just below the flower, you can see the young seed pods starting to form, and it's a cluster of these green, sort of star-shaped. And when they ripen, which is sort of in the second or third week of June, it opens up, and you can see the picture on the upper right, and splits and reveals these teeny green seeds. And in the wild, those seeds will fall on the damp mud, because usually by mid-June, the water level has dropped in the wetland, and there's damp mud under the shade of the trees or under the foliage of the plants, and land on that damp mud. And those seeds actually will germinate within a couple weeks. And by September, you can see a bunch of nice baby plants. Typically, they'll start blooming in the second or third year of their life. So this one's not hard to grow at all from seed, but you have to have access to the fresh seed and sow them right away. The pollinators for this are native bees. We've got about 270 species of native bees in Maine, and many of them are tiny. And so it's these tiny little bees that pollinate this. Now we've got a lot of our native shrubs that have fleshy fruits, and particularly the native dogwoods and shrub viburnum. So the picture on the top is our pagoda dogwood. That has these white frothy flowers, and that's very typical of our shrub dogwoods and viburnums, where they have these cluster of these teeny white flowers that attract a huge amount of teeny pollinating insects. And then after the flower goes by, they get these fleshy fruits. And in this photo I've got on the lower left are the nanny berry, Viburnum lentego, the high bush cranberry in the middle, and the silky dogwood on the right. The pagoda dogwood has navy blue fruits on bright red stalks. And when these fruits ripen, they are top bird food for our native migrating songbirds. They're high in energy, especially in proteins and fats, which are just what our birds need for their long migration south. And so these are great plants for supporting a lot of wildlife. Also, when they bloom, they're great pollinator plants. And then all of our viburnums and dogwoods support a lot of the butterflies and moths as host plants. So to propagate these, you have to collect the fruits when they're ripe, right when the birds want them. And I like to put them in a Ziploc bag and start mushing them with my hands, which will help the fruit break apart and let it ferment for about a week, and then rinse the seeds off and sow them right away. Lots of these take about, also have a double dormancy where they won't germinate the first spring. They'll germinate the second spring. And the reason is because we're on the northern end of where these plants are growing now. When the fruits ripen in late August and September or early October, the temperatures have already started to cool off. So inside these fleshy fruits are seeds, and the embryo of those seeds are not mature, and they need about 2 to 3 months of warm weather to finish maturing. So these same plants, if you were in Virginia or North Carolina or Georgia, they have a long, warm fall. And so when those seeds ripen, they fall in the ground after the bird eats them and poops them out, and they land hopefully in some leaf litter, they will germinate the next spring. But this far north, they often have a double dormancy and won't germinate till the second spring. So they're not hard to grow, but you have to get the seeds right when they're ripe and sow them and not let them dry out. All of our different native nuts. This is our native hazelnut, American hazelnut. We have 2 species of hazelnuts in New England. This is the American hazelnut, which produces a lot more edible nuts than the beaked hazelnut, which is common sort of a little in the northern half of Maine. But oaks, hickories, butternut, black walnut, beech nut, all of our native nuts, those seeds need to be harvested when they ripen, which is when they fall off the plant or when you see them maturing in late summer and early fall. And you do have to beat the squirrels and chipmunks who will grab them before you do. And those seeds can't dry out. And that's a mistake I hear from people a lot, where they collect acorns and then they leave them in their kitchen or they leave them on the dashboard of their car and they kill them. These seeds can't dry out. So when you collect the nuts, put them in a Ziploc bag and bring them inside. And I like to take the seeds, remove the husk, put them in a bucket or a cup of water overnight. If any seeds float to the surface, then probably a little insect has made that seed its home. And all of our native nuts have different kind of native insects that also need them for their life cycle. So it's not bad that there's some insects in there, but those seeds won't germinate. They've been eaten by the insects. So discard the ones that float or take them back outside and throw them in the woods. And then take those seeds and either sow them right away in a pot and take them outside. And you have to protect them from the squirrels and chipmunks and rodents. So if you're not prepared with some sort of wire cage, you can also take those clean seeds and put them in a Ziploc bag and put them in your refrigerator. Put a couple leaves in with them so they don't dry out, and then you can wait till late March to sow them. But you always have to protect our native nuts from squirrels and chipmunks and mice because they are very desirable to them, but they're not hard to grow at all. All of them need to be planted outside. You can't grow them on your windowsill. The seeds need a winter cold period and then they will germinate in the spring. White oak actually sends a root down that first fall, but most of them wait till the spring, but they need that winter cold period outside. So don't think you can grow our native trees on your windowsill. Now I'm going to move into more of the wildflowers that have seeds that aren't so tricky to handle. This is Jack in the Pulpit. This is blooming now. Wonderful wet woodland plant. This is from the arum family, which is mostly a tropical family, and the Jack in the Pulpit is the northernmost species in what is a tropical family. And so this is the flower, and most plants have flowers that have both male and female sex organs. The stamens and the pistils are the sex organs of the plant, with the stamen being the male and the pistil being the female. Some plants have separate male and female plants, and Jack in the Pulpit is one of them. Holly is another well-known one. And so you need to have both male and female plants to get to get cross-pollinated and get seeds. And then a few species can switch back and forth from year to year. And Jack in the Pulpit is like that, where one year the plant might be male and the next year it will be female. So the easiest ways to tell the female plants is after the flower goes by. The flowers are actually below this striped hood, so you can't see them when they're blooming unless you cut them open. But after the flower goes by, the female ones will start to form these green, shiny berries, cluster of berries that when it's mature is about 1 to 2 inches across and changes from emerald green to bright red. And so when they're red, you can collect those seeds and squeeze the seed out and either sow them immediately, or you can store them dry and sow them later in the fall. And a little bit, I'm going to walk you through how to sow the native seeds. Violets, we have about 25 native species of violets in Maine. They tend to, most of them bloom in the month of May, and they're pollinated by native bees. All of our violets are also host plants to lots of different butterfly species. So even when they're not blooming, the foliage is really important for supporting different butterfly species. They lay their eggs on it, and then the little caterpillars hatch and eat the leaves. So after the flowers go by, you can see this purple flower in the middle, the one just to the right of it, how it's pointing down. That's what the seed pod will look like, and it's about 1/2 inch long and green, maybe 1/8 of an inch or 1/4 of an inch wide. And as they start to ripen, the pod goes from hanging down like this to pointing up and then splitting open. And you'll see these golden brown seeds, and sometimes they shoot off from the plant, sometimes they stay there and then drop on the ground. They also have a teeny little fleshy protrusion that the ants like. So these are also ant dispersed seeds who carry them off and discard the seeds under the leaf litter. But all of our violets have a secondary emergency strategy for when they don't get pollinated. And so it must be because they're spring bloomers that in their evolutionary history, they've had springs where we've had so many rainy days that the flowers don't get pollinated. So the secondary strategy is that in midsummer, new flowers emerge, but you never see those flowers. They actually burrow underground, and they don't get pollinated. They're actually asexual reproduction. They're actually seeds that are exact clones of the mother plant. And you can see this little pod on the right. They're not quite ripe yet, but these little white seeds forming, and those are the clone, exact replica of the mother plant. And peanuts do this too. With peanuts, what happens is the flower burrows underground and the seeds form below ground, and that's what a peanut is. So violets do that, and then they ripen, and those also will reproduce. So it's really easy to collect violet seeds. When you see the green pod points up and then it splits open, you can collect the seeds and just store them in a paper bag and then sow them outdoors later in the fall with the methods I'm going to show you in a minute. Those seeds can be stored dry. They don't have to be sown immediately. Wild geranium, these are also blooming now in the woodlands around Portland. And they are pollinated by both native bees and hummingbirds. And after the flower goes by, if you look above the upper right-hand flower, you'll see a little green, long, beak-shaped pod. And each flower produces 5 little seeds. And I don't know that my image is covering the little ripened seed on the screen here, but they turn black and they spring off from the plant. And land, this is a way that the plant can get the seeds to spring off and land a couple feet from the mother plant. And those seeds will kind of fall under the leaf litter and hang out below there. And then they need to go through a winter cold period, and then will germinate the next spring. I collect a lot of these seeds, and I have to check the plants once or twice a day that, every day new ones will ripen. They'll turn from green to black and spring off from the plant. So the easiest thing is just to let them seed into the landscape. But you sow these seeds outdoors in late fall and they will germinate the next spring. But like most of our wildflowers are perennial. So they don't typically bloom until a couple years later. So with wild geranium, it's usually 3-year-old plants that start blooming. Bluets, this is also blooming now. People often have this if they have wet, scraggly lawn. If your grass isn't too thick, you can have bluets in it. They're also common in meadows and open woods. And they're these cute, these are tiny little plants, just a couple inches tall, and the actual flower is about 1/4 to 1/2 inch across. And people are often great if they have this in their lawn. They'll mow around it, but once the flower finishes blooming, then they'll start mowing it. And I encourage you to wait a month after they bloom before you mow it, because that's how long it takes. It's about a month after the flower goes by before the seeds have ripened. And they're quite challenging to find after they go by, because they're just a little tan stalk with a little 1/8 of an inch across little pod with teeny little seeds inside, but it's very easy to snip them off and put them in a white envelope, and then you can sprinkle them where you want to grow. If you have scraggly lawn, you should be happy if you don't have dense, lush grass. There's so many great native plants that you can grow in there. Columbine, red columbine. This is our only native columbine. There's a lot of lavender or purplish or blue columbine. That is not our native columbine. That's probably the Eurasian one, which has naturalized in Maine. Our native one is this red with a little bit of yellow. It's just finished. Most of them have finished blooming in my garden. They've been blooming for the last 3 or 4 weeks. They're pollinated also by hummingbirds and bumblebees. And after the flower goes by, you'll get this green upward facing with long spidery sort of awns after them. And when they're ripe, they turn tan and split, and you'll see a bunch of little black seeds inside. Typically, a plant will disperse its seeds over about a 3-week period, as the wind slowly shakes them off. A plant like this, this one here with lots of flowers will produce thousands of seeds. So it's very easy to collect some seeds and disperse them where you want them to grow. They do need a winter cold period before they'll germinate in the spring, but very easy to collect these seeds. Sometimes people say, oh, I planted some red columbine and it didn't last in my garden. And I would say it probably because you killed it with too much mulch. If you look where this plant grows in the wild, it can be in full baking sun on a seaside cliff getting sprayed by salt water in a dry site, and it can be in rich deciduous forest and rocky ledge. And what it needs is ledgy or gravelly sloped soil. When it's buried by either leaf litter or too much mulch in your garden, it rots the crown. So letting it tell you in your yard where it wants to be is great. It grows really well in stepping stones or gravel, or if you have a dry stone wall, that's a perfect environment for it. And of course, if you have rocky ledge. So very easy to collect these seeds. our native blue iris, which is also blooming now. And this is also pollinated by both bees and hummingbirds, and you see butterflies visiting it too. And this is common in wet meadows, stream sides, ponds, roadside ditches. But after the flowers go by, it's also 3 months before the pods ripen. So the pods don't ripen until mid to late September. So what usually happens in roadside ditches and meadows, people have mowed it well before the seeds ripen. So many of our native plants that are still persisting out there in meadows are getting mowed away, that people might see them blooming, but then they're mowing them before the seeds ripen. So you really need to, it's why you need to wait and mow, not until late fall to let our native plants reproduce. So these are perennials. So a plant will live for a long time, even if it's not allowed to reproduce, but eventually they die out. And we are really wiping out all of our open area wildflowers by mowing them away. So this pod is anywhere from 2 to 3 inches long by 1/2 inch wide. It's green, and then as it starts to ripen, it turns tan and splits from the top. And one pod will have at least 100 closely spaced chestnut brown seeds that you can just store in a paper bag and sow outdoors in late fall. And so one plant like this will produce thousands of seeds. And again, each of those seeds will be genetically unique. Wild strawberry, they're mostly done blooming now, and then little strawberries will start to form, and really easy to collect those seeds. You just have to not eat it. Instead, take that ripe fruit and smear it on a piece of paper or cardboard, let it dry overnight, and then you can fleck those seeds off, store them in a paper envelope, and then sow them outdoors in the late fall or early winter. All of our different milkweed species, this is swamp milkweed, are very easy to collect the seeds. So they're all great pollinator plants. The monarch butterfly needs the milkweed plants for its reproduction. It has to have the foliage of milkweed to lay its eggs on, for those caterpillars then to hatch and then eat the foliage till they grow and become fat and can crawl off and then pupate and make an adult butterfly who then reproduces. But all of our milkweed also support a lot of other pollinating insects. And I love this picture because you can see a fritillary butterfly. You can also see one of our many beautiful native bees, and you can see how hairy this bee is. That's where our native bees are. A lot of them are extra hairy, which makes them superior pollinators. The honeybee, which is not a native species, it's not an invasive species, so it's not a problem, but they're not as hairy as our native bees, so they aren't as effective at pollinating our native plants. On my swamp milkweed plants, when the monarch shows up, all the other insects run away. I think the monarch might be a little bit of a bully when it's drinking the nectar of these plants. So after the flower goes by, the pod starts to form, and you have to wait till the pod dries and splits before the seed ripen, and then they're very easy to collect. You can store them in a paper bag until you sow them in the late fall or winter. They need a winter cold period to germinate. They don't, I've had a lot of schools that have been trying to grow milkweed, and they've been trying to do it all under lights indoors, and they really need, those seeds need a winter to be outdoors. Bunchberry, one of our little native dogwoods. This is a circumboreal species, which means it grows throughout the northern hemisphere, New England all the way through to the Pacific Northwest, throughout Canada, then jumping over to Russia, all across, all the way through Europe. Obviously, those are separate populations, but they're all the same species. And this plant is blooming now, and it's pollinated by native bees. And then in August, the fruits ripen, and you can just collect the fruits, put them in a Ziploc bag, again, mush them to get the pulp to ferment. What you're trying to do is mimic a bird or animal eating it in its stomach, let it ferment a little, for a week or two, and then you can clean and rinse the seeds. You can either sow them right away or soon after outdoors. They need a long winter. You know, most of our species, if they get 3 months of cold, that's enough for them to germinate. This being a boreal species, it really needs 5 months of cold before they will germinate. And then they actually germinate really late in the spring. Mine here in Portland have just germinated in the last week or two. They wait till the heat of summer to germinate. And it must be they've learned something in the Arctic that if they germinate too early when it's cool, they will then get snowed on. We have several lobelia species. This is Cardinal Flower. We also have great blue lobelia. Those are our 2 lobelia species that make great also garden and landscape plants. The red Cardinal Flower is pollinated by hummingbirds. And again, they're after the nectar, and their body, when it brushes up against the flower, also gets the pollen stuck to it. And then when they go visit another flower, that's how they help cross-pollinate it. Bumblebees will also drink the nectar of the Cardinal Flower, but their tongue isn't long enough to reach down the long throat. That's like the characteristic of a hummingbird pollinated plant. It's not that they have to have the red flower, it's the long throat has evolved to match the hummingbird's beak. So what bumblebees do is they actually cheat and they go cut a slit at the base of the flower to get at the nectar. It doesn't hurt the plant though. But after these bloom, it's usually September when you'll see these little green seed pods turn tan, and you'll see little teeny dusty seeds inside. And those seeds also need cold weather before they'll germinate. And in the wild, where they want to land is damp mud, just like the marsh marigold. So if you look in the picture on the upper left, you'll see all that damp mud. That's where this year's seeds will be germinating. It's very easy to collect these seeds. This plant, you know, a lot of the lobelias that are sold in a typical garden center are hybrids of either our native Cardinal Flower hybridized with a lot of tropical species. And when you hybridize plant, you mess up the sex organs often. So think of how a mule is a hybrid between a horse and a donkey, and they can't reproduce. That's true of a lot of our plants. When they hybridize, they often have messed up sex organs, so they don't reproduce. They also don't produce the same amount of pollen or nectar. So, you know, make sure you're planting the straight species in your garden. Otherwise, the hummingbird comes and visits the flower and it either has no nectar or much less. So these are very easy to grow from seeds sown outdoors in the fall. Blue vervain, this is one of our late July, early August wet meadow, roadside ditch, streamside, pondside wildflowers that also is not as abundant as it used to be because we are mowing it away. So this is a great butterfly plant. When it blooms, it's often covered with butterflies and other little pollinating insects. And then the seeds ripen in mid-October. So when are people mowing? People, you know, for some reason, people think they should start mowing their meadows now or in midsummer, but that is killing all of our native plants and all the, you know, life that lives in a meadow. Mid-season mowing is the equivalent of a clear cut to all of our meadow species, whether it's the native plants or all the birds and insects and amphibians and mammals that live in that meadow. If you are harvesting hay, yes, you need to mow it now or in July to get a hay crop. But if you just have a meadow, let it bloom and wait until the frost has happened. Wait till November before you mow it. So these seeds are really easy to collect once they are ripe. Store in a paper bag, and then you can sow them later in the fall with the way I'm going to show you. And then some of the easiest of our native plants to grow from seed are the asters and the coneflower. So on the left here is black-eyed coneflower. On the right is New England aster. And both of these are some of our easiest wildflowers to grow from seed. Interestingly, those seeds can be sown in the spring and will germinate. They don't have to go through a winter, although they all germinate better if you sow them outdoors in the late fall or winter. So in New England aster, those are some of the last seeds that I collect, and it's the first or second week in November. And again, this is why we need to change our mowing practices in our open areas, roadsides, and meadows, and not mow anywhere during the growing season. We are preventing these wild plants from reproducing, and you're also wiping out the habitat for all the meadow creatures. So now I want to talk a little bit about what's going on in the nursery trade with our native plants and give you a cautionary tale with the example of purple coneflower. So purple coneflower is a prairie wildflower, doesn't grow wild in New England. Its native range is upper state New York, western Pennsylvania, down through the southeast and all the way out through the prairie states. There's about a dozen coneflower species native to North America, and they all make excellent garden plants. That a lot of them have great herbal uses. And you know, this plant was beloved by native gardeners and herbalists, you know, for, you know, starting in the 1970s. And then in the early 90s, when I was actually propagator at the Native Plant Trust Botanical Garden in the Woods, this plant won the Perennial Plant of the Year award from the Perennial Plant Association. And since that time, all kind of breeding has happened with this plant. So this is the wild form of the plant, and put it anywhere from 2 to 4 feet tall. The flowers can be pale pink to deep pink. The petals droop down, and it's a great butterfly and bee plant. And then after, when the seeds ripen, it attracts a lot of birds over the fall and winter pecking at the seeds. So if you go to a garden center now, there are all kinds of different new novel forms of this plant that have appeared, and a lot of them have been hybridized between the various species of Echinacea. And there's, you know, a yellow species of Echinacea. There's the Tennessee coneflower where the petals don't hang down. They go out like a daisy. And so if you look in the picture, you'll see orange ones and yellow ones, or ones with the flowers standing out like a daisy and not drooping down. The one in the middle, that's a double flowered form where the sex organs, the stamens and pistils, have mutated, and they look like little petite petals. So they have that pom-pom look. Now, gardeners tend to love double flowers because they bloom and bloom and bloom. And that's, again, because what's happened, the flower has lost its ability to reproduce. Those stamens and pistils have mutated and look like a petal. And so there's no pollen, there's no nectar, there's nothing for the bees, there's nothing for the birds. They're evolutionary dead ends. And while that might look nice to us, if we are adding native plants to our garden because we want, you know, we recognize that humans have, you know, not supported nature well, and we want to bring native plants back into our landscape, we don't want to start selecting for these weird forms that don't support other wildlife. And so, you know, most of these Echinacea cultivars that you get at nurseries, they're all being mass produced, mostly in Texas. There's a big breeder down there. A lot of these plants are patented, which means you can only buy your stock plants from the patent holder. You're not, as a nursery, you're not even allowed to propagate these plants. You have to buy on. They're all being produced in a process called tissue culture. That's where they take some tissue from a mother plant, culture it out in a petri dish, and then prick those, you know, those cells start to mutate, and they form little teeny plants. They're pricked out, they're grown on in these greenhouses, and, you know, where there's millions of identical plants, they use lots of nasty chemicals. You know, a greenhouse full of 1 million genetically identical individuals is, you know, a huge vector for pests and diseases. So they use all kind of chemicals that are not ecological. This is what I do not want to see happen with our native plants. Here's a great native shrub. This is called dwarf yellow honeysuckle. It's Diarvilla lonicera. This is just about to bloom now. It's a widespread shrub in Maine, and it has nice foliage. It's maybe a shrub anywhere from 1 to 4 feet tall. And if you look at this, the flowers here, it has yellow flowers, and they're pollinated by bumblebees. After the bumblebee pollinates it, the flower turns orange or reddish, so you can see that's which flowers have been pollinated already. And then they produce these little tiny green capsules that ripen also not until October. But if you look at this picture, you see that little purple edge on the leaf. And also when it leaves out in the spring, it will have a purplish or reddish cast to it. And a lot of native plants, particularly the trees and shrubs, in the first week or so that they leaf out, they will have this reddish chemical. It's an anthocyanin, and it's a chemical to deter early herbivores. So remember, when our plants come out in the spring, they are desperate to photosynthesize. And so it just repels bunnies and deer and insects from eating the leaves, and it only lasts a week and then it goes away and they turn green. And if you go to a nursery these days, there are so many red forms of different plants, and that's seen as very ornamental by people, and it stays red all season, and it's where somebody found a mutant of that plant and it keeps that chemical in it all season long. Well, it turns out that that chemical, so remember, every single one of our native plants is host plants to all kind of other life forms, particularly the Lepidoptera, the butterfly and moth family. So you know how the monarch butterfly needed milkweed as a host plant. Well, this yellow bush honeysuckle is a host plant to a handful of other native Lepidoptera. And I have now seen in the nursery trade now has a red foliage form of this that stays red all season. Well, those butterflies and moths, if they come and lay their eggs on that plant and the egg hatches, it will not eat it. It tastes bad to them. So what I'm trying to discourage you from is looking for these novel forms of our native plants, because they don't tend to support the other life forms. So whether it's double flowers or purple or maroon or red or even black, or wild geranium, there's a black foliage form of it. And wild geraniums host plant to 25 different species of butterfly and moth, but they won't use them as host plants with those weird forms. And so they clone these plants to keep those traits. So how do we overcome this? What do we do? What we do is sow the seeds. And so now I'm going to, that's a huge part of what Wild Seed Projects is about, is helping people recognize the importance of seed-grown native plants to perpetuate these, these wild characteristics, keep those wild traits, and to support genetic diversity. So I get people coming up to me a lot saying, "Oh, we're so happy that you're saving the native seeds." And I say, Wild Seed Project is not about saving the seeds. It's about getting a lot of people to sow the native seeds, whether it's nurseries or individuals. This is something that all of us can do. This is not rocket science. Our seeds have evolved to germinate and grow. And I've grown thousands of different native species. Lots of them are easy to do. So on our website, that's a big part of our nonprofit work, is we collect and clean and process and store. All of our seeds are stored in glass jars in the refrigerator and then packaged up in small batches. We do this with a team of volunteers. It's very labor intensive, and then we mail them out through our website. If you are interested in learning more about seed collecting, that to me comes after you have sown the seed. The first step is to become a propagator and grow more plants, and not just go out there and start grabbing the seeds without knowing. Since I've walked you through the different needs of different native plant, it's not always intuitive what they need. And you really have to know what you're doing and how to judge the rightness. So first become a native seed sower. And now is not the time of year to do that. Do this. Now's the time of year to look and observe and then do it. So I'm going to walk you through how to do it. So the best time of year to sow the native seeds is late fall or early winter. So everything you've learned, if you're a really good vegetable gardener or grow all your own annuals, most of those vegetables and annuals are either tropical or Mediterranean plants. Therefore, and they've also been domesticated for generations, or some of them even thousands of years. And so one of the things that's happened with domestication is over time, people by saving the seeds, they're selecting for the seeds that have thinner seed coats that germinate right away. Our native seeds have a protective heavy seed coat, and it's the winter outdoors that helps the freeze and thaw that helps break apart that seed coat so that they will germinate. And so what you do is you take the seeds, and I like to do it on New Year's Day. So by fall, I don't mean September. I mean late fall. I mean once the weather has really gotten cold and raw, and the dormant season has really kicked in. So not really before mid-November, ideally. So I like to tell people, mark your calendar over, in November that you're gonna plan on which species you're gonna sow, get the seeds. You can purchase them from us, or if you did collect them yourself, and then get set up to sow. So I like to have people sow them in pots or to make a special bed. Everybody wants to toss their seeds out into the world, but the problem with doing that, remember, most of the seed that a plant disperses in the wild don't land where they end up germinating and growing. They either get eaten by a bird or another animal, or they land somewhere that they're not gonna, is not the right place for them to germinate and grow. So when people sow seeds outdoors, most of those seeds are not going to make it to adulthood. You sow them in a pot or in a prepared seed bed. And I like to get people to use good organic potting, compost-based potting soil, which there's plenty of great brands available now. Fill your pots. You can use 4 or 6-inch pots. Then sprinkle the seeds on the soil surface. Native seeds are very different from vegetables too, in that they're perennial and they like to be sown close together. If you sowed your vegetable seeds this close together, they quickly grow and crowd each other out. But native seeds are like teenagers. They really like to be sown close together. Then you cover the seeds with coarse sand, not with more potting soil. And a good rule of thumb is to cover the seeds to the depth of the thickness of the seed, and then push the label down, water them and carry them outside, and put them in the shade in a flat site, somewhere flat like the north side of your building, not under a drip line, and cover them with wire. And the reason you need to cover them with wire is to keep the cat or the squirrels or chipmunks from digging in there. So in the shade, a flat spot, and let them go through the winter. Doesn't matter what the weather does, rain, snow, sleet, winter thaw, then rain, then ice storm, then 2 feet of snow, and then more thaw. Our native seeds love that. So they are unprotected with the exception of the wire to keep the rodents out. And then what happens is in early spring, the seeds start germinating, and some of those 2-year to germinate ones that I talked about earlier, they're some of the first to germinate, usually in March. The second the snow melts, you will see them germinate when it's still regularly going below freezing at night. Other species will start germinating in early April. This picture is taken during the 2nd week of April. And then by, this picture was taken just 2 weeks ago. By mid to late May, you will have lots of baby seeds germinating. So here, if you look in this picture, these are 4-inch pots. So 9 4-inch pots takes up 1 square foot of space. Each of these pots can have anywhere from 50 to 150 seedlings in it. This is a very economical way to produce a lot of plants. And then what I like to have people do is, not everybody's very anxious to get those plants out in their garden right away, but there are so many weeds germinating and growing quickly in your garden. You'll be much more successful if you grow these little seedlings on through the summer. And the easiest thing to do is to take that whole pot, gently tip it out, keep the seedlings together as a clump, and put them in a much bigger pot, a gallon pot. If it's milkweed or aster, you can put it in a 2-gallon pot, and you will get, 1 to 2 feet of growth that summer above ground. Milkweed, by the way, a monarch butterfly can still find those plants even in that first year. That foliage gives off volatile oils that the monarch can find, and they will use them as a host plant. So I'm going to show you some close-up pictures. This is wild geranium. So remember how I explained that native seeds have a heavy seed coat. So sometimes with some species, and geranium's one where that first spring, not all of them will germinate. So this pot is showing the ones that germinated the spring before, and that's those big, deeply scalloped leaves, and the little round leaves are the ones that germinated the second spring. And this is a good strategy in a wild plant, not to have all its seeds germinated at once. In fact, a dry spring like we have had now, in the wild, very little, most of the seeds that germinate in a wild in a dry spring like this won't end up growing and making it, because they germinated and then it never rained. So this is where sowing them in pots. These are Jack in the Pulpit seedlings. Those little 4-inch pots got 30 baby Jack in the Pulpit. So those little plants are just an inch, just single little leaf, an inch across. So I then would tip this whole pot out and put it in a bigger pot to let it grow on. And then in the fall, you can move the plants to their permanent location. Obviously, if you're a nursery, you would be dividing the plants up and putting them in pots to sell. But as a individual, it's very low maintenance, and you don't disturb the roots at all by just moving them to a bigger pot and not dividing them up. This is silky dogwood. This is one of our native shrubs that's the fastest to grow from seeds. So they will germinate the first spring. This picture, is taken in early June. This is about at least 60 plants in this little 8-inch pot. So I will now move that 8-inch pot into a 2-gallon pot. And in September, I will be able to plant a silky dogwood hedge very easily. All of our native plants are really losing their place in our world. I studied plant ecology back when I was in college in the late 70s and early 80s. And, it is shocking how many what were once common are now not very abundant anymore. But you can help. You can start bringing these plants back into all of our landscapes. And the Wild Seed Project website is filled with all kind of free resources on the whys and hows of growing native plants. The whole website is a huge resource. And a really great action that we developed last year is centered around our pledge to the rewild, where if you go on our website and you sign our pledge to the rewild, you will then get a free online pathway of learning where we will send you every 2 weeks, the different 10 action steps of rewilding, from planting native trees to, how to speak to your neighbor. So I really encourage you all to go look at our pledge to rewild. Go visit our seed sale page. This isn't the time to buy native seeds. It will be back in the fall, but you can go look and read about all the different species we sell. Rewilding, I really like that term because it's the wild traits of our native plants that we want to preserve and bring back into our landscapes. We need to make our landscapes more friendly to other nature and to our native plants and not domesticate them. And we have a great publication, our new tree guide, which I'll hold up. We just came out with, this is a great little native book. It's the first action step on the pledge to rewild, plant native trees. If you become a member of Wild Seed Project, you get a copy of that. Our website, we also have a great where to find native plant section, from listing different native plant sales that are happening throughout the season, to nurseries that are really selling, the seed grown and the wild type native plants. There's so many great free resources. I am more than happy to answer people's individual questions if you want to ask questions, because I know I went through a lot of material. So I'll go silent and let Jess and Aaron field the questions.
Well, first, thank you, Heather, so much for that great and informative talk. Jess and I have failed to confer in the background, so I'm just going to ask the first question I see, and maybe Jess will grab one of the others after I've done that. So the first question we have is, are there any native shrubs or flowers that are good to use to help mitigate erosion by the oceanside?
Yeah, we have tons of native shrubs that thrive on the oceanside. Bayberry, our wild rose, beach plum, yellow bush honeysuckle. Again, if you go to our website and look at our comprehensive plant list of native plants under our learning pull down bar, you'll see lots of different resources on that. But yes, we have tons of great native shrubs. The beach rose, that's actually not a native species, that's a Eurasian species, it's from Japan. So yes, we've got tons of ones that would do that. Also other herbaceous species too, like the seaside goldenrod is easy to grow and holds the coast well.
Great,
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, and anyone who has questions, you feel free to put them in the chat or in the Q&A. I'm seeing questions show up in both of those places. And thank you, Heather, for such a great and beautiful talk. I mean, the photos of all those plants are just so pretty. Just really, really.
Well, that's
pretty.
one of the things that upsets me a lot. People are think that the native plants aren't good enough looking to put in your garden. And again, go to our website if you need to be visually inspired. These plants are beautiful, and it's just people don't know them anymore, and they're not abundant out there anymore. In a typical open on your road, on roadsides and meadows, 50% of the species that are growing are not the native species anymore. So people aren't seeing them.
Yeah, well, I mean, here's a really specific question. So Wendy states, our garden bed is full of sun, not wet at all. Will wild petunias live there? Cardinal flowers? It sounds like many of these plants need mud and ponds and lots of wet earth. What would you suggest for dry and sunny?
Oh, we have tons of plants that love dry and sunny. So Monarda, the spotted bee balm. We've got several aster species. The easiest way for you to go learn about this is to visit our website. And if you go to the seed sale page, you can click on the image and it will tell you where the different species grow. We also have different planting by habitat listing. So we have tons of great species. Pussy toe, that we've even got dryland violets. There's, if you have a dry conditions, you actually have less competition with a lot of the common weed plants, which thrive in sort of moderately moist soil. So don't be frustrated by dry sites. We have lots of native species. But you can get whole lists on our website, and that will be more useful to you than me rattling a few off. Just go pour through the website.
Sure, and a quick one that might go back to that previous answer. Where to purchase Viola sororia, wild violets?
The reason violets are hard to get, like I would love to be offering seeds of that, but it's pretty hard to collect a lot of seeds on the violets. So go look at our nursery listing on the website. There are a few nurseries that do have them. So some of them are mail order, and we just updated our nursery listing and again, it's nurseries that are focused on, they don't have to only have native plants, although a lot of them are only native, but it's nurseries who have focused on offering native plants, because most nurseries, that might be in your neighborhood will have a very small percentage. So you're going to have to go do some hunting, but you can find some violets if you look. It'll just take a little more work.
And we've had a couple requests to just spell out the website. So for anyone looking, it's wildseedproject.net. Just wanted to get that in before the next question from Jess.
So here's a question. If you've attempted to grow native seeds and they've not germinated thus far, is it safe to assume they won't come up the remainder of this growing season?
It depends when you sow them. So usually when people fail with seed sowing, they either didn't sow them, they didn't give them a winter outside. So I'm going to assume that this person did, but if they sowed them out in the spring, and they were a species that needed a winter outside. The other thing that can kill seedlings is for them to start germinating and then drying out, which is why I tell people, keep your ungerminated seeds in the shade. By early May, if you leave the house and go to work every day and it's a hot sunny day, if you've got little baby seedlings germinating, they can dry out in one day. So if those pots are in the shade, that they just won't dry out so quickly. And then once they germinate, if they're a sun-loving species, you can move them in the shade. The other thing why people can fail is if they buried the seeds too deeply. So that's where covering seeds with coarse sand, it lets a little light through, but still keeps the seeds moist. Or people just sowed the seeds in their garden or in their your garden soil has millions of dormant weed seeds in there. If you're lucky, it might have a few leftover remnant from hundreds of years ago native seeds, but it's probably mostly all the introduced agricultural weeds. So if you sowed the seeds directly in the ground, to sow them directly in the ground, you have to have made sure you killed all the weed seeds there by either solar, the organic way to do that is to put down black plastic or solarize the soil or heat it with a flame. But if you've just sown the native seeds out with other in your garden, all the weed seeds are all annual and they grow about 50,000 times faster than any native seeds. So if it's a 2-year, I never throw even ungerminated pots that, let's say it was an aster or something that should have germinated that first year and it seemed, I don't know why it didn't germinate. I have places in my garden where I put, pot, I throw that soil and you wouldn't believe what comes up a couple years later. So I would keep them in the shade, unless you think one of those other reasons might have happened. But it's the beauty of the winter seed sowing. The seeds are so well hydrated. They germinate much more successfully than sowing, even something like an aster, which when you sow those outdoors on January 1st, those are some of the first seeds to germinate in the spring, like April 1st. If you sow them out in the spring, because they do not need a winter cold period, they take a couple of weeks before they germinate. So you do them in the winter, they germinate on April 1st. They just went through the cool spring weather to send roots down. So timing is, I would say, is the thing people mess up with a lot.
Great. I keep getting the sort of variety questions. Can you suggest anywhere to get native lupin seeds?
Well, we sell them on our website, but again, you're past the time to sow the native seed. So there is a native lupin in Maine. It's not the one that you see growing on the roadside. That's from the Pacific Northwest. Our native lupin is extinct in Maine. It's rare throughout New England. You know, mostly our native lupin grew like in pitch pine, sand plain areas. So it was never common in Maine. And it's, you know, those are the perfect areas to be developed. So it's mostly been paved over in New England, but it's a plant that ranges from Nova Scotia all the way down to Georgia and all the way out to Wisconsin and Iowa. It was a wide ranging species. So we sell it, but now is not the time of year to do it. So you'll have to wait and sow them outdoors in the fall. But if you go to our listing, Prairie Moon Nursery, you could get the seeds from now. Go to our website, nursery, look at our nursery page, where to find native plants.
There's a question related to the website. The native tree book, can people buy multiple copies of that?
Yes, so you can purchase them directly through the website. You know, if you're a community group or something like that, and you want to purchase more than 10, you can send an email and Lisa would set you up with a wholesale order. But yes, you can purchase them through the website or send an email.
Okay, and let's see. This person asks or says, I'm a brand new gardener and have thus far planted Bloodroot, purchased at a farmer's market, blue flag iris, bottle gentian, will soon plant swamp milkweed, red columbine, and low blueberry. Aside from the columbine, which others need mulch, and how much or how thick a layer of mulch?
Well, you know, if it's a woodland plant, most plants, you know, are used to growing with leaf litter or even a meadow species, a little stuff around. It's just columbine wants rocky ledge. So the other ones you should, you know, if you don't have access to leaf litter now, I do like that Coast of Maine enriching mulch. It's a decomposed bark mulch with a teeny bit of seaweed in it. That's a nice mulch for a new native garden. And then, of course, next fall, and you can read our blog on why you should leave the leaves and why leaves are gold in your garden. But you could, I like that Coast of Maine enriching mulch for a new garden if you don't have a lot of leaves right now.
It looks like we have one last question. And this is from someone who's actually joining us from the Midwest and trying to grow native plants in Chicago. I'm wondering if there's any resource or network in the Midwest, as there are different native plants there.
Well, we share a lot of the same. Yes, I saw your email earlier and I will answer it. Our membership, we have a bunch of people in the Midwest, but the North American Native Plant Society, which is out of Toronto, would be another good resource for you. And you've got a couple great native nurseries, Prairie Nursery and Prairie Moon Nursery. Those are two ones. Prairie Nursery's in Wisconsin, Prairie Moon is in Minnesota. Those are two of the oldest native wild type ecological native seed grown native nurseries. So you have a great resource there too. But we do share a lot of the same plants as you too. So all the content on our website is, you know, the lessons are the same. You have more extreme weather than us. In fact, we have to look to the Midwest for role models on dealing with extreme heat and extreme storms that we traditionally haven't had to deal with in New England.
I actually have a question to add myself that I did not type in the chat to us. And that is about seed collecting. So you showed us all these, you know, seeds and the kind of seed phase of a lot of these wild plants. And you mentioned that live plants that don't germinate quickly are poached and sold at nurseries. So I wondered if you wanted to give any guidelines on seed collecting. I was in the Lowell Preserve last week, and right along the trail there was one lady slipper. It was fantastic. It was perfect. It was right in bloom. I didn't touch it. I took pictures of it. And it was totally alone. And I'm thinking that some of these plants make a lot of seeds, but what would be good guidelines on, you know, if you see plants and they're in their seed stage and you want to take seeds, how much is too much, or can you assume that there are many, many seeds out there?
That's a great question. So first of all, I consider seed collecting after you've learned to sow the seeds. And the reason is what I just walked you through. It's not always clear on what the seeds need. So first of all, the first thing you have to do is make sure you correctly identified the species when it's in bloom and checked with your state natural area. You know, every state, including Maine, has the Maine Natural Areas Program to make sure it's not an endangered species. Also, you are not allowed ever to collect on typically parks and, you know, state parks, national parks, lots of conservation land. You can't just go walk and collect seed. But so let's say it was your land that you were walking on. You saw it when it was in bloom and you correctly identified it, that it wasn't a rare species. Then you have to research, you know, the germination requirements, you know how to judge when it's ripened. And so, like I just walked you through, it's not always intuitive. You know, the easy ones are asters and milkweed. Those are easy. Those are good places to begin if it's your land. So if it's not your land, let's say it's on the side of the road where it's probably might get mowed anyways, you know, go knock on whoever's, you know, you should still go knock on the person's door. Don't just, you know, so you have to be ethical about it. And then you should just collect a very small percentage. So let's take milkweed. You know, if there's a milkweed patch and milkweed's in hot demand now, and you collect 10%, and then Jess collects 10%, and then other people collect 10%, poof, it's all gone. So the seed collecting has a lot of issues with it. Now, it's one thing if you're just going to take a few seeds and sow it yourself, but you really have to have seen it when it's in bloom. And we did a manual for the Maine DOT. It's called, the DOT hired us to create a manual for them to support the natives on roadsides. And you can view it on the Wild Seed Project website under our publications. And I outline the protocols for seed collecting in that manual. So you can go, you could actually at the library, it'd be great to just print it out and staple it together. Unfortunately, you know, because it's the DOT, they printed a limited number and poof, no more. But you can go read all of that on the Wild Seed Project website, and you're welcome to, you know, if you have a good quality printer, print it out, because it's a great resource on the seed ripening and collecting. And I outline the steps you need to know about, make sure it's your land, make sure you've identified with it. It's in bloom and then it's not an endangered species, and you've researched when the seed ripened and you know how to handle the seed. So if it's a seed that has to be kept moist, that you put it in a Ziploc bag and handle it properly. If it's one that can be dry, that you do that. So that's where I've spelled it out. I haven't spelled it out on our website yet. I haven't figured out how and why to do that because it's complicated because of the ethical reasons.
Great, thank you. And it's become such a thing with foraging wild foods. And when a species becomes a hit, especially in restaurants, that can be a huge threat. So you wouldn't want the same to happen with the seed world.
I should include wild leek on this talk because I wrote a great article for Maine Organic Farmers and Gardeners. You can go see that digital on growing wild leek from seed, because that is not sustainable the way it's being harvested. And you can grow it. I grow lots of it, but it takes a decade to build up your stock to then be able to harvest it. So I'd love to see more organic farmers doing that. And yes, it's a big problem with the seeds too. Just being, you know, we have really pushed back nature, and we don't want us well-intentioned people grabbing seeds and then killing them. And, you know, so become a seed sower first. And the fun thing is you get to watch the whole life cycle of the plant. You learn to recognize it as a seedling. And you'll be very proud. You'll be like a mother with all your little baby plants. It's really not hard with lots of species. And then you quickly make a lot of new plants. And it's a cheap way to get them out in your landscape. It couldn't be a cheap, more economical way to populate your landscape. So I hope
there's one.
The website. There's also we have lots of blogs on different aspects of gardening with native plants that will answer a lot of these questions too.
One last quick question that came up, and I think the answers to this and any related question is on your website, which is amazing. But this one last, is it too late to sow milkweed? I assume, I'm not sure if they're asking about milkweed seed into the ground or if they're talking about seedlings, but.
Yes, it's too late to sow milkweed seeds because they need that winter outdoors to break up the heavy seed coat, and lots of the native seeds, they have to go through a winter. Remember, think where we live. They've evolved with a cold period. That's part of their germination needs, a winter outside. So it's too late to sow them now. But if you have milkweed seeds, put them in a Ziploc bag and put them in your refrigerator and mark your calendar for next Thanksgiving and say, okay, I'm going to think about sowing those and a bunch of other seeds over the holidays.
Yes, mark your calendar. I just marked mine with the Wild Seed Project seed sale in September and then the sowing in November. So,
well, you can buy the seeds anytime starting okay. Well, we sell them all through the fall, winter, and spring, but we turned it off now. But
okay, it's off now.
But a lot of this, the new seeds start coming in the late summer, fall, and like I said, their seeds I'm still collecting in November. So late fall.
That's great. That's really great. And I do know that Maine Audubon is selling plants right now, native plants that they've germinated, or I don't know where they've gotten them. I know Eric germinates a lot of seeds in his backyard, but so that if you're looking for something in addition to all the nurseries, Maine Audubon is having that sale. So
and I will have a seed sale in September, a plant sale in September too.
Oh, and you sell plants in September too. Okay, great.
And they'll be mostly our first year seedlings. So these little baby plants. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you. I mean, I think we've come to the end. We've come to the end of the questions in the chat, and we've come to the end of our time. And Heather, thank you so much. You are just, such a wealth of knowledge. It's really, really been fantastic. And your website is too, I know. So yeah, thank you. And thank you, Erin, for being such a great co-host.
Thank you, Jess. Thank you, Heather, for joining us. And thanks to our attendees. We hope you'll rejoin us for the sustainability series again in the fall, and that you'll have a great summer of watching the life cycle of wild plants here in Maine.
Get outside.
Exactly. The sun is still up. Great. Thank you both so much. And thanks everybody for joining.
Everybody. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.